Hello everybody and welcome to chapter 7, which is the last chapter of Paddington at Large. And I'm joined by Tilly, who I think looks like Paddington, don't you think? With like ears and whiskers all akimbo. So I'll be giving her some treats once in a while and we'll see if she'll stay for the whole story. Chapter 7 is called Paddington and the Christmas Pantomime. Harold Price, said Mrs. Brown, wants to see me, but I don't know anyone called Harold Price, do I? It's the young man from the big grocery store in the market, said Mrs. Bird. He said it had something to do with their amateur dramatic society. You'd better show him in then, said Mrs. Brown. Now that Mrs. Bird mentioned it, she did vaguely remember Harold Price. He was a rather spotty-faced young man who served behind the jam counter, but for the life of her she couldn't imagine what that had to do with amateur dramatics. I'm so sorry to trouble you, said Mr. Price as Mrs. Bird ushered him into the dining room, but I expect you know there's a drama festival taking place in the hall round the corner this week. You'd like us to buy some tickets? Asked Mrs. Brown, reaching for her handbag. Mr. Price shifted uneasily. Well, no, not exactly, he said. You see, we've entered a play for the last night. That's tomorrow. And we've been let down at the last moment by the man who was going to do the sound effects. I was told you have a young Mr. Brown who's very keen on that sort of thing, but I'm afraid I've forgotten his Christian name. Jonathan? Asked Mrs. Brown. Mr. Price shook his head. No, it wasn't Jonathan, he said. It was a funny sort of name. He's been on television. Not Paddington, said Mrs. Bird. That's it, exclaimed Mr. Price. Paddington. I knew it was something unusual. I wrote this play myself, he continued eagerly. It's a sort of mystery pantomime, and we're hoping it may win a prize. The sound effects are most important, and we must have someone reliable by tomorrow night. Have you ever met Paddington? Asked Mrs. Bird. Well, no, said Mr. Price, but I'm sure he could do them, and if you'll come, I can let you all have free seats in the front row. That's most kind of you, said Mrs. Brown. I don't know what to say. Paddington does make rather a noise sometimes when he's doing things, but I don't know that you'd exactly call them sound effects. Please, appealed Mr. Price, there just isn't anyone else we can ask. Well, said Mrs. Brown doubtfully as she paused at the door, I'll ask him if you like, but he's upstairs doing his accounts at the moment, and I'm not sure he'll want to be disturbed. Mr. Price looked somewhat taken aback when Mrs. Brown returned, closely followed by Paddington. Oh, he stammered, I didn't realize you were I expected someone much older. Oh, that's all right, Mr. Price, said Paddington cheerfully as he held out his paw. I'm nearly 4. Bears' years are different. Quite, said Mr. Price. I'm sure they are. He took hold of Paddington's outstretched paw rather gingerly. Mr. Price was a sensitive young man, and there were 1 or 2 old marmalade stains he didn't like the look of, not to mention a quantity of red ink from the debit side of Paddington's accounts, which somehow or other managed to transfer itself to his hand. You're sure you hadn't anything else planned? He asked hopefully. Oh, no, said Paddington. Besides, I like theatres, and I'm good at learning lines. Well, they're not actually lines, Paddington, said Mrs. Brown nervously. They're noises. Noises? Exclaimed Paddington, looking most surprised. I've never heard of a noises play before. Harold Price looked at him doubtfully. Perhaps we could use you in some of the crowd scenes, he said. We're a bit short of serfs. Serfs? Exclaimed Paddington. That's right, said Mr. Price. All you have to do is come on and say, Odds bodikins, every now and then. Odds bodikins? Repeated Paddington, looking more and more surprised. Yes, said Mr. Price, growing more enthusiastic at the idea. And if you do it well, I might even let you say gazooks and scurvy knave as well. Perhaps you'd both like to go into it, or down the hall, said Mrs. Brown hastily as she caught sight of the expression on Paddington's face. A very good idea, said Mr. Price. We're just about to start a rehearsal. I can explain it as we go along. He did say it's a pantomime, said Mrs. Bird when she returned from letting Paddington and Mr. Price out. I think he did, replied Mrs. Bird. Said Mrs. Brown. Well, if Paddington has a paw in it, there'll be plenty of pantomime. You mark my words. Here we are, said Mr. Price as he showed Paddington through a door marked Private, Artists Only. I'll take you along and introduce you to the others. Paddington blinked in the strong lights at the back of the stage and then sniffed. There was a nice smell of grease paint, and it reminded him of the previous time he had been behind the scenes in a theatre. But before he had time to investigate the matter, he found himself standing in front of a tall, dark girl who was stretched out on a couch. Deirdre, said Mr. Price, I'd like you to meet the young Mr. Brown I was telling you about. He's promised to lend a paw with the sound effects. The dark girl raised herself on one elbow and stared at Paddington. You didn't tell me he was a bear, Harold, she said. "I didn't know myself, actually," said Mr. Price unhappily. "This is Mrs. Flint, my leading lady," he explained, turning to Paddington. "She's in bacon and eggs." "How nice," said Paddington, raising his hat politely. "I should like to be in bacon and eggs myself." "You look rather as if you have been," said Miss Flint, shuddering slightly as she sank back onto the couch. "I suppose the show must go on, Harold, but really—" Mr. Price looked at Paddington again. "Perhaps you'd better come with me," he said hastily as he led the way across the stage. "I'll show you what you have to do." After giving Miss Flint a hard stare, Paddington followed Mr. Price until they came to a small table in the wings. "This is where you'll be," said Mr. Price, picking up a large bundle of papers. "I've marked all the places in the script where there are any sound effects. All you have to do is bang some coconuts together whenever it says horses' hooves, and there's a gramophone for when we have any music or thunder noises." Paddington listened carefully while Mr. Price explained about the script, and he examined the objects on the table with interest. "It looks a bit difficult," he said when Mr. Price had finished his explanations, "especially with pause, but I expect it will be all right." "I hope so," said Mr. Price. He ran his hands nervously through his hair and gave Paddington a last worried look as he went back onto the stage to join the rest of the cast. "I do hope so. We've never had a bear doing the sound effects before." Mr. Price wasn't the only one to feel uneasy at the thought of Paddington taking part in his play, and by the time the following evening came round, everyone in the Brown household was in a high state of excitement as they got ready for their outing. Mr. Price had been as good as his word, and he'd not only given Paddington a number of tickets for the family, but he'd slipped in an extra one for Mr. Gruber as well, and even Mr. Curry had promised to put in an appearance. Paddington went on ahead of the others, as he had one or two last-minute adjustments to make to his gramophone, but he was waiting at the door to greet them when they arrived just before the start of the performance. He was wearing a large rosette marked "Official" in his hat, and he looked most important as he led the way down the crowded aisle to some seats in the front row of the stalls before disappearing through a small door at the side of the stage. As the Browns settled down in their seats, a roll of thunder shook the hall, and Mrs. Brown looked up anxiously. "That's very odd," she exclaimed. "Thunder at this time of year? It was just starting to snow when we came in." "I expect that was Paddington testing his sound effects," said Jonathan knowledgeably. "He said he had quite a few claps to do." "Well, I wish he'd turn the volume down a bit," said Mrs. Bird, turning her attention to the stage as the curtain began to rise. "That ceiling doesn't look too safe to me." "I think someone must have forgotten to pay the electric light bill," whispered Mr. Brown as he adjusted his glasses and peered at the scene. Mr. Price's play was called "The Mystery of Father Christmas and the Disappearing Plans," and according to the programme, the action all took place one night in the hall of a deserted castle somewhere in Europe. From where they were sitting, the Browns not only found it difficult to see what was going on, but when their eyes did get accustomed to the gloom, they found it even harder to understand what the play was about anyway. Several times Father Christmas came through a secret panel in the wall, holding a lighted candle in his hand, and each time he disappeared, it was followed after a short interval by Mr. Price playing the part of a mysterious butler. If Father Christmas was acting strangely, Mr. Price's actions were even more peculiar. Sometimes he came on waving the secret plans with a triumphant expression on his face, and at other times he looked quite sinister as he shook an empty fist at the audience to the accompaniment of a roll of thunder. Behind the scenes, Paddington was kept very busy. Apart from the thunder, there were the coconut shells to be banged together whenever anyone approached the castle, not to mention clanking drawbridge noises and creaking sounds each time a door was opened. In fact, there was so much to do, it took him all his time to follow the script, let alone watch the action on the stage, and he was quite surprised when he looked up suddenly in the middle of one of his thunder records and found it was the interval. "Very good work, Mr. Brown," said Harold Price as he came off the stage, mopping his brow and stopped by Paddington's table. "I couldn't have done it better myself. I don't think you missed a single cue." "Thank you very much," said Paddington, looking very pleased with himself as he returned Mr. Price's thumb-up sign with a wave of his paw. Quite a lot of people had come and gone in the first half of Mr. Price's play, and altogether he wasn't sorry to sit down for a while and rest his paws. In any case, the serfs had to put in several appearances during the second act, and he was anxious to practice his lines while he had the chance. It was some minutes after he had settled himself under the table, with the script and a jar of marmalade, that he noticed an unusual amount of noise going on at the back of the stage. It seemed to have something to do with Harold Price having mislaid his secret plans. Several times his voice rose above the others, saying he couldn't go on without them because a lot of his most important lines were written on the back. Paddington scrambled out hurriedly in order to investigate the matter, but by the time he stood up, everything had gone quiet again, and order seemed to have been restored as the curtain went up for the second act. Paddington was looking forward to the second half of Mr. Price's play, and even though a lot of people were still creeping around behind the scenes with anxious expressions on their faces, he soon forgot about it as Father Christmas made his entrance and approached Miss Flint's couch in the centre of the stage. From the little that could be seen of him behind his beard, Father Christmas looked most unhappy as he addressed Miss Flint. "I had hoped to bring thee glad tidings," he cried in ringing tones, "but alas, I am undone, for I have lost the secret plans." "You've what?" exclaimed Miss Flint, jumping up from her couch in alarm. Miss Flint had spent the interval in her dressing room, and she was as surprised as anyone to learn that the plans really were missing. "What have you done with them?" she hissed. "I don't know," said Father Christmas in a loud whisper. "I think I must have put them down somewhere." Nice weather we've been having here lately," he continued in a loud voice as he played for time. "Hast thou read any good books lately?" From his position at the side of the stage, Paddington looked even more surprised than Miss Flint at the sudden turn of events. Mr. Price had carefully explained the play to him, and he felt sure no mention had been made of any character called Tidings. Then there was a question of the cloak. Father Christmas appeared to be wearing his cloak in exactly the same way that he'd worn it all through the play, and yet he definitely said something about having it come undone. Paddington consulted his script several times in case he'd made a mistake, but the more he looked at it, the more confused he became. It was as he turned round to the desk in order to play one of his thunder records just to be on the safe side that he received yet another surprise. For there, lying in front of him, was a dog-eared pile of papers with the words "Secret Plans, Property of Harold Price," written in large letters across the front. Paddington looked at the papers and then back at the stage. A nasty silence seemed to have come over the audience, and even Father Christmas and Miss Flint appeared to have run out of conversation as they stared at each other in embarrassment. Coming to a decision, Paddington picked up the secret plans and hurried onto the stage with a determined expression on his face. After raising his hat several times to the audience, he waved in the direction of the Browns and Mr. Gruber and then turned towards the couch. "Odds bodikins!" he cried, giving Father Christmas a hard stare. "I've come to do you up." "You've come to do what?" repeated Father Christmas nervously, as he stood clutching the candle in one hand and the end of the couch in the other. "I'm afraid I can't see anything about glad tidings in my script," continued Paddington, "but I found your secret plans." Paddington looked very pleased with himself as a burst of applause came from the audience. "Scurvy knave!" he exclaimed, making the most of his big moment. "Gadzooks! You left them under my coconuts." "I left them where?" said Father Christmas in a daze, as Paddington held out the plans and he exchanged them for the candle. "Under my coconuts," explained Paddington patiently. "I think you must have put them there in the interval." "Fancy leaving your plans under a bear's coconuts," hissed Miss Flint. "A fine spy you are." While Miss Flint was talking, a glassy look came over Father Christmas. So much had gone wrong already that evening, it didn't seem possible anything else could happen, but there was definitely a very odd odour coming from somewhere. "Can you smell something burning?" he asked anxiously. Miss Flint paused. "Good heavens!" she cried hurriedly, taking the candle away from Paddington. "It's your beard! It's on fire!" "It's all right, Mr. Christmas. I'm coming," called Paddington as he climbed up onto the couch. "I think I must have held the wick too close by mistake." A gasp of surprise went up from the audience as Paddington took hold of the beard and gave it a tug. "Well, I'm blowed," said a voice near the Browns, as the whiskers came away in Paddington's paws and revealed the perspiring face of Harold Price. "Fancy that! It was the butler all the time, disguised as Father Christmas." "What a clever idea," said a lady in the row behind. "Having him unmasked by a bear." "A most unusual twist," agreed her companion. "My play!" groaned Harold Price, collapsing into a chair and fanning himself with the secret plans as the curtain came down. "My masterpiece ruined by a bear!" "Nonsense!" exclaimed Miss Flint, coming to Paddington's rescue. "It wasn't Mr. Brown's fault. If you hadn't lost the plans in the first place, all this would never have happened. Anyway," she concluded, "the audience seemed to like it. Just listen to them." Mr. Price sat up. Now that Miss Flint mentioned it, there did seem to be a lot of applause coming from the other side of the curtain. Several people were shouting, "Author!" and someone even appeared to be making a speech. "I feel," said the judge as they joined him on the stage, "we must congratulate Harold Price on his pantomime. It was undoubtedly the funniest play of the week." "The funniest," began Mr. Price, "but it wasn't meant to be funny." The judge silenced him with a wave of his hand. "Not only was it the funniest, but it had the most unusual ending I've seen for many a day. That Surf Bear," he said as he consulted a piece of paper in his hand. His name doesn't seem to appear on the programme, but he played his part magnificently. Remarkable timing, the way he set light to your beard. One false move with his paw and the whole lot might have gone up in flames. I have no hesitation," he concluded amid a long burst of applause from the audience, "in awarding the prize for the best play of the festival to Mr. Harold Price." Harold Price looked rather confused as the applause died away and someone called out, "Speech!" "It's very kind of you all," he said, "and I'm most grateful, but I think I ought to mention that although I wrote the play, young Mr. Brown here had quite a large paw in the way it ended. I shouldn't be standing here now if it wasn't for him," he added as he turned to Paddington amid another outburst of clapping, "and I wouldn't like to think he'd gone unrecognised." "How kind of Mr. Price to give Paddington some of the credit," said Mrs. Brown later that evening as they made their way home through the snow. "I wonder what he meant when he said Paddington had a paw in the ending." "Knowing Paddington's paws," said Mrs. Bird, "I shudder to think." Mr. Gruber and the Browns looked back at Paddington in the hope of getting some kind of an explanation, but his head was buried deep in his duffel coat, and he was much too busy picking his way in and out of their footprints to hear what was being said. Paddington liked snow, but while they'd been in the theatre, rather too much had fallen for his liking, and he was looking forward to warming his paws in front of the fire at number 32 Windsor Gardens. Apart from that, the sight of a Christmas tree in someone's window had just reminded him of the date, and he was anxious to get home as quickly as possible so that he could hang up his stocking. There were several more days to go before the holiday, but after watching Mr. Price's play that evening, Paddington didn't want to take any chances, particularly over such an important matter as Father Christmas.